My name's David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's a great pleasure to have Cynthia Isenhour with us today. I had the pleasure, I guess, of meeting you for the first time last spring when we were just our paths crossed for various reasons. Probably most of you know Cindy quite well, but for those of you who don't, she's in anthropology as an assistant professor. She's a cooperating faculty member in the Climate Change Institute, and I'm delighted to say a faculty associate here in the Mitchell Center. She's not only going to talk about sort of a broad view of the challenge of sustainable consumption, but she's very much putting her interest and expertise to work in Maine. And what is it, 2 weeks from this Friday, am I doing this right? Yeah, has with a bunch of other folks organized a session. It may be the most broad convening of stakeholders on the issues of solid waste management in the history of the state. So very much engaging, talking to people, and these are issues you read about in the paper every day, not only right here in Maine, but of course around the world. She's done field work all over the world, Central America, China, Scandinavia. She's published widely in journals like the International Journal of Innovation and Sustainable Development, American Ethnologist, Journal of Consumer Behavior, Ethics, Policy, and Environment. And the first time I met her, I often am on a steep learning curve for the language that's used by different disciplines. One of hers is certainly the field of political ecology, but she said something that I had to write down, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it means. Neoliberal responsibilization of individuals. Did I get that right? Yeah, and so I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot today. Please join me in welcoming Cindy here.
Thanks, David. I promise I will not use the neoliberal responsibilization of individuals.
Do you know how to get to your thing, or do you want me to do that?
I think I can do it.
Exit out of it.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you to David and to the Mitchell Center for the invitation. I do appreciate it. I see it as a new faculty member, a great opportunity to engage with and find areas of common interest with many of you. So when I received the invitation from David, I made a bit of an odd choice, and I hope you'll forgive me for it. Rather than presenting research already accomplished and presented and tied up in a tidy bow, I decided that you all could surely find my publications, and that instead it would be really advantageous to use this as an opportunity for me to coalesce some ideas about a research project that I'll be proposing with Sharon Wagner-Klein next year. So let me just give you a brief overview. So the first thing I'll do, and I'm not going to spend much time here because I'm at the Mitchell Center, and I can assume there's probably a pretty good environmental literacy about the problems, but I'm going to frame this particularly in relation to consumption, which is not always the dominant frame. And then talk about a building momentum that we see in international policy particularly, but also at the city level, not so much at the state level, toward moving beyond technological efficiency gains and ecological modernization ideas. And this comes through growing realization of rebound effects, leakage, backfires. I'll explain what those mean in a minute. And then in the third part of the presentation, I'm really going to try to get to a research proposal where we are refocusing on reduction and reuse. So sustainable consumption, focusing a little bit more on demand side of consumption and production systems. Okay, so we all know in this room and many others that we have significant challenges associated with our contemporary linear system of materials management. So we put materials through a system and waste most of them. I don't have to go through all these. Natural resource depletion associated with extraction and use. Of course, that comes with associated water pollution, fossil fuel combustion in processing and manufacture, emissions and air pollution, climate change. We all know these, right? But we also get environmental damages at other places in the commodity chain and in the life cycle. So associated with use and ecotoxicity, but also waste management. So here in the state of Maine, as many of you know, we have an increasingly large problem with waste management. The potential loss of incineration capacity and the potential to have to create new landfills or significantly expand the capacity of existing landfills. When we send things to landfills, we also get nutrient loss and significant inefficiencies in the system, habitat and biodiversity loss. So we all know that we have these problems, and that they are increasing. right, in length of time. So over the last century, global materials use have increased by a factor of 8. So due to significant advances in industrial ecology, but also ecological economics, we're gaining a better understanding of this through tools like the ecological footprint, but also the Stockholm Resilience Center's concept of ecological boundaries or planetary boundaries. So we see that over time, we're getting more and more consensus around these terms like ecological overshoot or even ecological debt. So we know that we need better systems level thinking in terms of materials management, thinking about not just a linear system, but thinking about how we can look at impacts across the entire life cycle of products and services. So we see the rise of concepts like closed-looped production or a circular economy, which has become quite a buzzword along with the green economy and the concept of zero waste. This is not new to any of you, of course. But despite the rhetoric and the promise, we find that we're not achieving those systems, right? We still have considerable leakage. So we can think about a circular economy, even though many states and local governments understand that we've got to, cut down on extraction and make a bigger area of thickness in the circular economy, loop back in, right, through recovery of valuable materials such as metals, you name it, right? But we're seeing significant leakage, we would call it, out of that circular economy. Whoops, wrong way. So one of the issues I would suggest today, and backed by lots and lots of empirical research, is that part of the reason why we haven't been achieving a true circular economy is because we have focused much of our effort and much of our policy in one area of the circular economy. We have been focusing on ecological modernization efforts, or efforts to direct the material economy through the manufacture process, through policy designed to increase the efficiency of our materials use and the efficiency of our energy use. So we can continue to produce. We just need to do it smarter and better, right? So that's where we've really been focusing. So, and for good reason, right? I don't want anyone to mistake me and think that I'm arguing that efficiency efforts aren't extremely important, right? You guys will have to excuse me. I'm just getting over the flu, so I'm still a little shaky and thirsty. First of all, they're convenient. They're inexpensive, so we can think of this as low-hanging fruit, right? The idea that we can very often get below-cost opportunities to improve the efficiency of our production and consumption processes. We get good returns on investment. They're also really politically viable, right? They're easy to do. Nobody can argue against improving the efficiency of our production processes. They're also really consistent with the logic of market-based reform and ecological modernization, and they build on this idea of progress that is so characteristic of our society. The idea of consumer confidence, growth in the green economy that we heard so much about at the last Rio meeting. So a lot of this is based on the idea of decoupling, which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure. And the idea is that we can, over time, continue to increase gross domestic product, and at the same time to reduce environmental pressure through lots of different technologies, right? Through transition to better technology, through a transition to service sector industries and information industries rather than material intensive industries. And many national and state governments have really made strides toward this. And we do have pretty significant empirical evidence that we're seeing relative decoupling. Right, so we're seeing less environmental harm, but we don't have a whole lot of evidence to support the idea that we have absolute decoupling, so that we would actually see growth in GDP simultaneous with declines in environmental impacts. So it raises the question, can we achieve our targets, whether it's 450 parts per million greenhouse gas concentrations, or whether it's materials use, can we achieve that with technological progress and efficiency gains? So this brings me to the second part of the discussion, which really leads to the importance of consumption. So we do see a building momentum to move beyond technological efficiency and ecological modernization for a couple of reasons. So one is that we, again, due to improvements in our understanding of industrial ecology and of ecological economics, we can start to model scenarios for future, for example, in this case, emissions, right? So this is from Jackson's 2009 book that looks at the carbon intensity of our economy. So this is the carbon per economic unit. And we see that now here's the carbon intensity for the world, here's the UK, here's Japan. So some of the wealthy, environmentally progressive countries that have, in policy, sought decoupling, right? That have consciously tried to transition to information and service-based economies. And we see different scenarios. So scenario 1 is 2050, 9 billion people. So these are assuming some level of population growth and some level of economic growth. And we see that in order to meet the IPCC target, that it's going to be tough. It's going to be really tough. So we see, if we have average annual emission cuts of 4.9% to meet the target, that's assuming a 7% population growth per year, 1.4 income growth. That would mean that technological improvement would have to increase by 7% per year, which is 10 times faster than the current rate. And that in order to reach, by 2050, our carbon intensity to meet the 450 parts per million, we would need to be at about 40 grams of CO2 equivalent per dollar, which is a 21-fold improvement over where we are today. So it raises questions of, is our current strategy an adequate strategy? In the materials economy, can we continue to focus on the way that people are manufacturing products and continue to focus on just increasing the efficiency and the materials efficiency of what we have? This is very Debbie Downer, isn't it? We can also see the same types of scenarios in terms of materials. So here's an interesting chart that just came out a few years ago from the European Environmental Agency, looking at domestic materials consumption. And I'll make a quick disclaimer. This is not total materials requirement, but this is domestic materials consumption. And we can see, so this is, by the way, this is the EU 15. So these are the more developed EU countries. We see GDP rising. We see population largely stabilized, but slightly rising. This is domestic materials consumption. A bit wavering, but not growing as fast but not growing as fast as growth. So we see that we have some serious efficiency gains, right? So the materials that we're consuming are not as intensive relative to our economy. But the interesting thing, though, is that this is domestic materials consumption. What's wrong with that picture? Yeah. These countries, like the EU 15 and the US, import a lot, right? We import a lot of goods and services that use materials gathered in other places, right? And so it's a bit of a misleading analysis. So there are a couple of what we can call emergent phenomenon, if we want to think in terms of complex adaptive systems, that we can associate with efficiency gains. So the first one is displaced environmental loads, or the idea of carbon leakage. So here's where I will present a little bit of my work. Much of my recent work has focused on very environmentally progressive, wealthy nations that have focused on decoupling strategies. I work in Scandinavia primarily. And there's now a large body of lit that shows that for example, Sweden, the energy and materials efficiency of their economy has improved drastically. So the carbon intensity of their economy has improved by 72% since 1980. They're getting much more efficient, which is great, right? The problem is that over the same time period, their imports have increased by 40%. And there's higher spending, household consumer expenditures. So what we see is that due to decoupling strategies in places like Sweden, where they're focusing on less materials intensive processes, but their consumers aren't consuming anything less materials intensive. We can think about carbon leakage, where it's a process whereby the emissions still occur, they just occur somewhere else, but on behalf of consumers in a different place. So that's one emergent phenomenon, and we can see, this is a Davis and Caldera map. They have many more that show displaced emissions associated with consumption. This is just a piece from my work. Sweden and China, of course, do quite a bit of trade, and it's increasing. And you'll see here, this is the carbon trade balance. So you'll see that over time from 1995, China to Sweden, you'll see the emissions embodied in the trade. So Swedes are importing an awful lot of emissions that are embodied in the goods that they import from countries like China. So how to address this in policy, right? Here in the U.S., we see a similar situation. We are also becoming more efficient in our production processes, but we see increase in imports from many countries that have much less efficient production systems. And a lot of this, I think, is tied up in stuff, right? We oftentimes don't think about embodied energy or embodied materials. We think about flows, right? Flows of energy. We're turning it on and we're turning it off, or we're putting it into a production process. But there are a lot of hidden costs associated with consumption regimes. Another concept familiar to, I imagine, most of you is the idea of rebound and backfire. And this is a phenomenon whereby when we do have more efficient processes, materials or energy, that we have savings. And savings allow us to reinvest either in more production or more consumption. And so, and so over time, we see that a lot of the gains associated with efficiency and technological improvement are actually cannibalized. There's a lot of disagreement on at what level, but there have been some really important pieces of literature that have come out. The Breakthrough Institute put out Energy Emergence, which got a lot of publicity and a lot of discussion about, what percentage of rebound are we going to get at what level of scale, at the micro level all the way up to a worldwide macro level. But we're seeing that idea gain ground so that the International Energy Agency has just recently decided to include rebound in modeling. There was, until very recently, an assumed linear relationship between technological improvement and efficiency or emissions, that we would, as long as technological efficiencies improved, emissions would go down. And we're actually seeing that linear relationship isn't quite as clear as we once thought it was. So here's just one example that I think I always use with students because it seems to sink in. Many of you have probably already seen this. So just for example, this again is from the EU, just because that's where I have previously done most of my work. This is between 1990 and 2010. You can see here that the number of TVs rises. So people are buying more TVs, even in the EU, right? You would think the market were saturated, but apparently it's not. And we see that over the same time period, the electricity consumption associated with TVs drops until a certain point when we get a new technology. But that the electricity consumption as a whole continues to rise, right? So we're not getting these absolute gains. And it has to do because we're consuming more. So each TV we might consume may take less electricity to produce and to use, but as long as we continue to consume more of them, we're outdoing the gains. So consumption becomes a really key figure, leading the European Environmental Agency actually to suggest, or at least raise the question that consumption is actually the mother of all environmental issues. We always think about environmental issues as being something associated with the natural environment, right? When in fact, those are symptoms of a deeper cause. This perspective has gained popularity and legitimacy, I guess you could say. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development in 2008 even put out a report that on page 6 said global consumption patterns can't be sustained, efficiency gains and technological advances alone are not sufficient. Changes will be required to consumer lifestyles. And I'll give you an example of this. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and try to start to bring it home. I started really at 30,000 feet at least, if not higher, and I'm coming down to Maine as I go. So one of the things that we know is that not only do we have to address consumption, but we also know that if we can address its source, go up the supply chain, it's it's maybe a little bit harder politically, but it's a lot cheaper and much more effective. So here's just one example. If we think about the plastic water bottle case. So here's an analysis done by the Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon, which is probably leading the way in the US in terms of sustainable materials management. So if we have a 32% recycling rate of this, a 37% recycling rate for plastic bottles versus a 62% recycling rate, we see a little bit of improvement in global warming potential and energy use, not a significant improvement in terms of carcinogenic potential or respiratory effects or ecotoxicity, but we get some improvement, right? So yes, we should recycle more plastic bottles. We should absolutely do that. Now, if we look at waste prevention up the supply chain, and we can get producers to lightweight their plastic bottles so that they're using less plastic in each bottle, we can compare that, and we see that, compared to the 37% recycling rate, the 62% recycling rate, or a 62% recycling rate of lightweighted bottles, we see much more significant gains across all these categories, right? So toxicity, emissions. Then if we go one step further and we do waste prevention at the consumer level, right? Don't use plastic bottles. Drink out of your tap. We see in a worst case, so the study took a worst case and a best case scenario for tap water, which I'm happy to talk to you about afterwards. We see much more dramatic improvements. And if we go one step further to the best case, it's significant, isn't it? So interesting to see what we can get when we focus on different areas of the life cycle and different areas of the supply chain. So I'll argue that it's not just me and it's not just the data, but we're increasingly seeing more emphasis placed on this side of the circular economy. Maybe because we understand reality better, maybe because it's the neoliberal devolution of responsibility to individuals. Sorry, I couldn't help. But I think we're also seeing the writing on the wall, right? That we need to start addressing demand. We need to start addressing total consumption, and just start thinking about these issues. This is consistent here in Maine with our waste hierarchy, which prioritizes policies and programs that reduce first. Above anything else, we are supposed to be reducing first. And this can be reducing up the supply chain through plastic lightweighting, or it can be reducing at the household level in terms of consumer choice. Beyond that, to reuse what's already in our system, right? And this doesn't, we don't mean recycling, this is waste avoidance. We still consider recycling waste, right? This is reuse. So this is secondhand economy. This is eBay and Craigslist and eco-design, where people are up designing materials to create new things. Then recycling, composting, which in my lens should be seen at a parallel level, but nonetheless. And then incineration or waste to energy, and then landfill. This is also consistent with the federal level Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which really set up this waste hierarchy idea. So the good news is that there is, and this takes me to the third part of the talk, there is a real identifiable and growing recognition of movement, and I'm using movement in a very broad sense here, from grassroots kind of practice, but also in terms of policy, to move more towards sustainable consumption. And we've been here for a while in a certain way. So we've been doing outreach and education for quite some time, right? Trying to encourage folks to buy green, to buy smarter, and we've been doing that for a while. I don't mean to be Debbie Downer, but I think we need to move beyond this, so I'm going to just briefly review what are some of the problems with this approach. One is that when we ask people to make rational decisions and to make greener choices, we're relying upon a rational choice model that assumes that they have perfect information, it assumes that they have perfect access, but we're not in a free market. We very rarely see that people do have perfect information about the costs and benefits of all of these products. And so the question is then, how can we expect them to make a fully rational choice? We also know that smart choices, even when people do make them, sadly enough, don't always end up in really objective gains. So there's a great study actually there are several great studies of households that were green, right, made green choices and compared them with households that, professed no interest in environmental issues. And when you looked at them objectively in terms of empirical data, impacts, there oftentimes are very marginal, if no, differences between green and brown consumers. And then third, one of the biggest findings to come out of this data, all of the work on sustainable consumption over the last 10, 15 years, is that focusing on individual choice is an individualistic strategy, but consumption is a social phenomenon, right? I mean, if you stop, this is the anthropologist finally, I guess you guys were probably all wondering why an anthropologist was talking to you about this, but consumption is fundamentally social. It's the way that we talk to other people. It's the way that we symbolize who we are, what groups we belong to, what our values are. And so to assume that you can ask individuals to modify that and create tension within those networks may be a bit naive, and frankly, it just hasn't worked. So we focused instead on, more recently, on regulation of choice. And so we can do this through voluntary, soft, hard policy. But the reality is that all sorts of surveys find we prioritize voluntary policy over soft policy and incentives over mandates. And it's just not very popular, right? Particularly in wealthy post-industrial economies based on free choice. So we don't see it as a highly politically viable strategy. There are also significant regulatory hurdles associated with regulation of choice. And then finally, we know that top-down policy lacks long-term legitimacy, and then oftentimes when the public isn't bought in to these types of ideologies, or they don't see the rationale, that they don't work either, they get undercut. So some of the most recent lit coming out is that we need to focus on collective or collaborative approaches to achieving more sustainable consumption rather than highly individualistic regulations or nudges toward choice. And we see that there's also suggested in literature the idea that if we had more collective approaches to sustainable consumption, that we might be able to improve local economies, trust, resilience, social capital even. So this brings me to kind of the end point of where I see a lot of the sustainable consumption lit right now, is the significant value of reuse, resale, repair economies, but also sharing and collaborative economies. So, and we can see this, again, in multiple movements. So we see it in the literal explosion of the sharing economy. So everything from Airbnb to Uber, all sorts of car sharing arrangements. So you can call it the sharing economy, you can call it collaborative consumption, but it's gotten a lot of buzz recently. We see in lots of cities, they're holding repair cafes where you can take your broken things, whether they be appliances or bicycles, and you take them to a cafe where they've recruited people who have some expertise in repair to teach you how to repair your own things. We've seen other communities implementing tool libraries, so rather than checking out books, you can donate your tools to the tool library and people can come and share them. We also see increasingly, if you look at the sectoral economic data on rentals, we see a profusion of rental companies, everything from party supply to heavy-duty machinery. And some of this is starting to gain traction at a much deeper level. So Shareable and the Sustainable Economies Law Centers recently put out a Policies for Shareable Cities document that's kind of like a toolkit for how cities can start to implement the sharing economy. And then the same institution also put out Practicing Law on a Sharing Economy. So trying to figure out how do you regulate and govern these types of sharing economies. Oh, and then of course we've had a long time track record of Craigslist and eBay, some of these technologically enabled sharing and secondhand economies. So I'm fairly new to Maine. I came in the fall of 2013. And as an outsider, right, or someone from away, is that what they say? It became very quickly apparent to me that Maine has an incredibly vibrant resale, reuse, and repair economy. Just driving, I live on Highway 1, and just driving up and down the coast, you see in the summertime, flea market after, and then a used car lot, then 5 antique stores, and it's very interesting to me how vibrant it is here, which I think raises a lot of, so we've got, yard sales, vintage shops in Portland, tool rental companies, the flea markets, Uncle Henry's, which I found incredibly entertaining to look through. But also, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, there are now, there is resale reuse tourism in Maine. Did you know that? The people are coming to Maine specifically because the thrifting is so good here. So these are a few of the blogs that have pretty considerable audience about thrift store adventures in Maine. So we also see increasing business activity around salvage and reuse, not only in building materials, but in other sectors as well. So I would argue, and again, I'm really high level here, so I'm happy to provide citations to back all this up, but research points to the importance of recognizing and supporting and potentially even incentivizing from a policy perspective existing collective institutions that can reduce materials throughput, emissions, and waste, but could also potentially improve local economies, social capital, community trust, and resilience, particularly in the face of things like, for example, abrupt climate change, right? So I know what many of you are thinking, because I've been doing this stuff for a really, really long time. And I know where people usually get population, of course, is the one big issue. And the other one is, well, if you reduce total consumption, you're going to damage the economy. Well, the interesting thing is that we're starting to see some empirical evidence, right? We oftentimes make assumptions without any sort of data. Here's one from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This is the only report, unfortunately, that I know of at the state level that attempts to look at the economic importance of or contribution of the resale, repair, and reuse sector to a state economy. And you'll see that they found direct employment of 46,000 people. It's not a huge percentage, but it's about 2% of the population. 5,000 indirect jobs, 8,300 in indirect through the spending of people who work in the reuse sector. 100 billion in wages, 159 million, you all can read. So some substantial economic importance associated with this sector. And perhaps more importantly, it's localized, right? So we don't see, we can think about reuses offsetting big box shopping, which leaves our economy. So, so that's, the Minnesota study is a study of the economic value of the resale, reuse, repair economy. There have also been beginning attempts to start looking at the environmental value or the environmental impact of our consumption. So the state of Washington, for example, has created a consumer environmental index looking at the impact of their consumption. And so so think about this, you have to kind of reframe, right? Consumption, not just or emissions, not just in their state, but total consumption, regardless of where it comes from, right? So tracking the things that the state of Washington is importing, no matter where it comes from, and tracing, through life cycle and multi-regional input-output analyses, tracking hybrid analyses, tracking those impacts. And so you can see in the state of Washington, we've got per person emissions associated with consumption have gone up. We've got per dollar spent, so we're getting more efficient, but we've still got aggregate gains. And some of these analyses are attempting to try to put together methodologies. So Washington, after this report, tried to put together an analysis of what the reused clothing sector could do to this. If people used all reused clothing, what would it do to these types of figures? So there are hints out there that reuse, resale, repair, and sharing economies could have really significant value in all sorts of sectors, but we have almost no data. We have the Minnesota study, we have some state-level life cycle analysis, consumer environmental index studies, but we don't have anything really comprehensive. So a lot of governments are implementing these sharing economies. There have even been proposals to remove all sales tax on reused secondhand items in the state of Oregon, but we don't have the data to really know what's the value, what's the impact, right? So I'm proposing a new piece of research to kind of capitalize on Maine's unique and vibrant resale, reuse, repair economy to try to measure the value of the sector in our state. Because we think, based on the literature, that it could lead to more sustainable consumption, to significant waste reduction, but also potentially to more resilient local economies and improved economic outputs. So we have proposed to measure in 4 categories. So the economic value, of course, suggests that there is significant economic value with reuse and sharing economies, but also in terms of employment and capture of economic gains. So the Minnesota, we would largely mirror the Minnesota, and I'm telling you all this largely because I want your feedback, and I want to know if other people are interested. I'm going to need some partners. Sharon has already agreed to partner with me. She may be in for it, but we'll be doing economic sector analyses of state-level gross sales and employment, analyses of commercial reuse sector data. Some of this is private data. Surveys of business owners in this sector. So we can't, a lot of the sectoral data doesn't capture, for example, Uncle Henry's, and it doesn't capture any peer-to-peer. So the Minnesota study, as large as those economic benefits were, there was no peer-to-peer there. That was all formal exchange. So surveys of business owners, also surveys of participants in the sharing economy to get an idea of their participation in this and why, right? Ecological values. So the assumption is that by displacing demand for new products and the production processes associated with those, secondhand and sharing economies can reduce resource demand, cut emissions. In Maine, they can help us to achieve our waste hierarchy, which is mandated by law. And we can do this through hybrid life cycle assessment, input-output analyses, which Sharon has some. Sharon came from Carnegie Mellon, which pioneered a lot of these tools, so we're really lucky to have her. Which can allow us to get to a lot of different things. We're still contemplating what exactly we're going to measure, probably emissions, which is fairly easy to do, water, materials use, maybe a little harder to do, toxicity. So that's where we can really, if we can figure out to what degree new production is offset, we can really get some interesting ecological data. And then the social value. Here comes the anthropologist now. A large body of interdisciplinary lit suggests that socially embedded forms of economic exchange can help to build social capital, can help to build trust in relationships of mutual support, which can be really important when we have shocks to the system, when we get shocks to access to the formal economy or to the market, inability to procure food from the traditional channels. So localized networks of reciprocal and socially embedded exchange can also improve resilience to shocks. So lots of different tools we can use here. We can use network analysis, asset mapping, surveys again of participants and control groups to measure for the relationship between participation in these forms and any sort of difference in social capital or trust in one's community. And then finally, the cultural value. I'm hoping to rope in some of my colleagues from the Maine Folk Life Center because it does seem apparent to me, although I don't have a whole lot of data to back this up yet, that Maine does, because of the nature of the rural nature of our state, the resource base of our state, we do have a very strong kind of culture, deep tradition of thrift, right? And we still see that evidenced in the vibrancy of the reuse and sharing economy. So we see that this is consistent with local identity and culture, and that existing institutions for sharing and reuse we can think of as culturally appropriate development, right? And there's many of you know there's an incredibly vast body of literature out there suggesting that if we can rely on culturally appropriate development, we'll have a much better chance of success. So we can look at historical examinations of Maine folklore. We can look at qualitative ethnographic research, interviews with folks who are participating to not only measure cultural value and consistency with Maine's identity, but also meaning. And I find this note very interesting, and I know many of you are probably familiar with the study that came out of our econ department about, maybe, I'm sure many of you know more about it than I do, that showed that when thinking about changes, wind energy or alternative energy, that there was much more resonance with people when we framed messages about alternatives in terms of what we're already doing and what we've been good at, right? And so I think that's very interesting to think about this in the context of Maine, that when people see things very consistent with their identity and their culture, that perhaps they have more chance of success. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there because I really wanted to leave lots and lots of time for discussion and feedback. This is, again, I have not written this grant proposal, but I do have a course release to work on it. But the plan is to submit to the National Science Foundation's Interdisciplinary Behavioral and Social Sciences program, which is one of their larger kind of interdisciplinary programs next December. So I'm looking for partners and ideas. So thank you. So, yes.
So I think it might be helpful to make a distinction between your reuse and versus your sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if it's that helpful to lump them all in together. Especially, I mean, I in particular, I quibble when anyone calls it even be a sharing.
Yeah.
Rentals.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't. And the other, I think you're going to find much more significant impacts environmentally on the reuse than you're going to find in economics. I'm fairly dubious of that Minnesota study.
Oh, are you? Okay.
And the reason is that in those in-plane models, those input-output models, the value comes from, say, if you buy something at Walmart, a cell phone, right, the value to the local economy is the retailing of it because you're actually quite all is important in the state. Mm-hmm. So but if I was to sell this to you, and again, the value is in retail exchange. We're not generating this phone in the States, so you might have a pretty much one-to-one loss from imported versus just reselling it in the same economies. I question this. I wouldn't push the economics, I would push the environmental aspect.
Yeah, but it's a good point, and I think so. I think it's a fairly ambitious study, and I to a certain extent, I'm tempted to replicate Minnesota just so it's comparable, but to a certain extent, I need to get this team in place, and maybe Jonathan, you'll join us. But we
Todd
could.
Dave or Gary Hunt would be. I can look at it, but Todd is the true expert on the input models. But most economists are pretty skeptical.
Yeah. Okay.
Of those models because they ignore.
Yeah.
The losses. They don't take out. Well, I didn't sell it at Walmart, therefore I've lost it.
Yeah.
So most are considered overstated.
Well, I will certainly pick your brain as we get closer. Yeah, I'd love to have you, as we're pounding out methodology, come and help us. Yeah. Mark?
Cindy, I was wondering about the potential in this realm for both rebound effects and licensing, because the people I know who participate most actively in this, it doesn't offset any other consumption. It's a net, sort of a net addition, and so that without sort of that accounting at the household level, right? What's the demand at the household level? We're going to miss that. We're going to miss that weather versus rebound.
Yeah, it's a big issue, and we're really going to have to quabble with that. And I'm not sure that I have the best answers yet. But I mean, I'm sure there are studies about car sharing that show that they actually backfire, right? people who didn't have access to cars before are now using cars. And so yeah, it's a big issue, and I think we're going to have to kind of deal with it on a sector by sector basis. But it is my intent, though, to get on the ground with some of these participants, so households that really do participate, and to do. My dissertation had lots of budget. We actually did some budgetary work and to look at before efficiency gains, after efficiency gains, and showed some rebound. But yeah, it's a good point. I'm really still struggling with how to get my brain around that. Most of the studies don't look at it at all, right? And so yeah, it's a tough one. I'm still a little in the weeds with that. Yeah.
I really like the second half of your talk. I have a criticism on the first half.
Oh, okay.
You said a couple times that you were being a Debbie Downer. I thought you were actually being wildly optimistic about your discussion of efficiency. It made it sound, I don't think you actually said this, but it seemed like if we could just get the efficiency up to 100% for recycling of all things, then basically the economy could grow forever on a finite planet. Of course, the problem with that is that there's an upper limit to efficiency, which is usually very low. For example, Carnot efficiency of an engine is 40%, optimum efficiency is 20%. Plants operate at an efficiency of 2%, millions of years of natural selection hasn't increased that. So the problem is that while we can recycle materials with an energy cost, we can't recycle energy, and it requires a huge throughput of energy to recycle those materials. So if we're trying to go for 100% efficiency, I think, we're missing the fact that we need that reliable, cheap energy inflow into the economy.
Yeah, maybe I did make myself clear that it was not my intent at all, actually, quite the opposite. I presented the decoupling model because that's what's dominant, but that's what I'm arguing against.
Right, but that violates the laws of thermodynamics, that decoupling model.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I just didn't hear that.
But it's dominant, right? I mean, you hear it all over in all sorts of different forms of green economy, and it's still the policy priority with OECD and.
Well, this is your opportunity. Seriously.
If you like that, you should read some of Alf Warnborg's work, HOR and BORG.
Okay.
He's got the shipping machine. He's really does great work on thermodynamics and decoupling. Okay.
Is there profiles, for example, an income bracket that you would focus on for the study? Of if there's a sector of the population that could make the biggest difference by adopting a kind of reuse lifestyle?
That's a really good question, and I think it gets to all sorts of complex motivations for reuse and sharing. You can think about, the term sharing economy has become so co-opted, but we think about that as kind of a Portlandia, or even this kind of local Portland, invention primarily engaged in by people who are fairly wealthy, versus what we see in a lot of Maine participation because of economic constriction and lack of access to alternatives, right? So I think it's really important that we get both, and that we can do some household work, some microeconomical with both.
Is one of the anticipated outputs a best practices or policy guidance for Maine? Is that where you were going with it? And then my further wonky question had to do with the policy and waste side in terms of Scandinavia versus Maine, or Scandinavia versus the United States, and the different ways in which waste itself is commodified in these places, and how that is a huge factor. In my understanding of it, it's much more on the EJ side, right? That because waste is so commodified, that's the other, right, angry neoliberal problem that when it's trying to convince people to cut down on consumption is because they're already part of an economy of waste.
Yeah. So I'll address the first one
Yes.
first. And yes, to a certain extent, so there's been this explosion of exuberance around supporting and incentivizing collaborative consumption and sharing, but it's not based on a whole lot of good data yet. So that's one reason is we should probably make smart choices. But another reason is if there is real value, policymakers I think would appreciate understanding that, right? And so is there a potential to in some ways support these already existing economies that do facilitate stronger local connection, but also do have some real ecological gains. I don't know, but certainly if we can make a case for the value, then maybe so. The second question, I'm not sure I fully understood, Darren, but just differences in U.S. and Maine context versus the Scandinavian context.
Well, it's just the way that RCRA is seen as a real, capital-intensive, neoliberal model for waste management, and the European systems tend to be more controlled, right? There's less of a, that the state owns everything in the European model, whereas here we have, Casella owns all our waste, right? Mm-hmm. They're invested in us keeping more and more involved in that system. I'm just wondering if those models would impact then a policy model, right? That we're already starting with this very commodified waste stream. I don't know. I mean, in terms of the policy output, so again, it's hard to. Yeah.
I'm part of that reuse economy. I ran a reuse bookshop in Bangalore. But when I look at my economic activity versus what happens with Bangalore Mall, it's, I think it's kind of a drop in the bucket. It's a positive thing, but I don't know how you stop every time I go out to the mall there's something new, and that seems to be continuing. Just one other comment. In terms of studying this reuse economy, yard sales, Uncle Henry's, a lot of that, I'm guessing, is cash sales and people that are not going to be very happy about sharing.
Just tell me from the IRA.
Well, I've thought about that a lot, actually. That's another kind of methodological challenge we're going to have to get around. But we're going to have to make estimates, right? And we won't be accurate, but I think it'll be useful to be able to hint at least in a suggestion of value. So, but I hear you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk later, but there might be some ways to break. I was thinking about that last issue. I mean, economists, not that we've done it well, but we do try to estimate sometimes black market economies.
Yeah.
And some of this, you might go to Boris and literatures on.
And anthropologists have long done lots of work on informal economy, right, which is what we call, And so, I think hopefully I can get some ideas.
Because it is a real challenge.
So, I was just wondering if humans are changing the human, I don't know, the people's needs or desires. I'm just thinking yesterday on NPR, we were talking about some survey that 50% of Americans feel overwhelmed by their stuff. Yeah. And they now are hiring, they interview people hire them to come and help them clean their closets.
Yeah, there's a whole lot, there's the happiness, and there's a whole lot of data to show that, people are discontent with the materialist lifestyle. All sorts of public polling research to indicate that, but also, self-reported happiness declining. I do think that the attitudes are there, right? But we still have a pretty significant kind of attitude behavior gap, which we've had for a long time. So I'm not sure how.
Well, like in Sweden, do they have used storage in Sweden, or they do?
Yeah,
I'm just thinking, like in Denmark, you have like one really beautiful candlestick holder. Everybody has the same one, but it's very beautiful. You don't have 20 of them in your closet and stuff. And you sit around and you drink wine and you're happy with people not buying as much stuff.
Yeah, I think I did a lot of this stuff in my dissertation, which was actually really fun to focus on how people that were really concerned about consuming less, how they managed to communicate their class status and also deal with all their money. These were largely successful people in less ecologically impactful ways. It's really fun part of my dissertation about it too, but it had to do with like model train sets, and collection of art, collection of mid-century modern furniture. It's reused, but it's highly sought after and extremely expensive. Yeah, so there are all sorts of ways that people kind of attempt to deal with it without compromising their class status, which is interesting, right? thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate it. And please, you can find me on, I'm here. So if you do have any other comments, or if you're interested in, potentially being involved in the study in some way, please do let me know. I think it could be really fun. So.
Let's thank Cindy again.